In the scorching heat of an isolated farm, a young housekeeper hears a human groan coming from the cornfield. Investigating, she finds an elderly woman tied up like a scarecrow, on the brink of death and ignored by all. This encounter reveals a cruel plot of family abandonment and silent manipulation that has been erasing the woman's existence for years. But what no one expected was that this discovery would awaken memories, secrets, and blood ties buried under the weight of silence. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's get started. The July heat beat down on Sweetwater Farms like a heavy, relentless curtain. Chloe wiped the sweat from her brow as she hung the white sheets on the clothesline out back, her nimble fingers carefully pinning each piece. The fabric billowed in the hot wind that carried the scent of ripe sugarcane. She sighed, wishing the day would just end already. It was almost 3 in the afternoon, the worst time of day. Chloe looked up at the cloudless sky and allowed herself a fleeting thought of what it would be like in the air-conditioned rooms of the main house. But she quickly pushed the fantasy aside and focused back on her work. Sweetwater Farms stretched majestically on the outskirts of Alexandria, in the heart of rural Louisiana, surrounded by miles and miles of seemingly endless crops. Sugarcane dominated the landscape like a green and gold empire, rippling softly when the wind decided to blow, creating a constant murmur that had become the soundtrack of the land. The property had history etched into every brick, every century-old oak, every gate worn by time. Generations of the Miller family had been born, raised, loved, and departed on this land, leaving their visible and invisible marks everywhere. The main house was an eloquent testament to prosperous times. An imposing plantation-style home, painted a brilliant white that gleamed in the sun as if made of marble. Its tall, dark wood windows, crafted by artisans long gone, contrasted elegantly with the light walls. Wide verandas wrapped around the structure like welcoming arms, offering shade and relief on the most brutal days. It was a house that commanded respect, that spoke of power and tradition, and that stood in stark contrast to the work sheds scattered across the property. Functional, unadorned buildings where the real life of the farm happened daily. Chloe had been working there for almost 2 years, ever since she left Monroe on a rainy March morning, carrying only an old suitcase and a heart full of hope for a better life. At 23, she still dreamed of things that seemed too far away to reach, but the job at Mr. Miller's farm at least guaranteed a roof over her head, 3 meals a day, and a modest salary she sent home religiously every month to her sick mother. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself as a child with big dreams, but it was an honest life, and that had its own value. It was as she pinned the last sheet to the line, adjusting the wooden clothespins to ensure the wind wouldn't carry the heavy fabric away, that she heard it. A low sound almost imperceptible amidst all the other afternoon noises, coming from somewhere beyond the clothesline, toward the cornfield on the other side of the property, where hardly anyone went at that time of year. Chloe froze, her body tensing in a way she couldn't explain, tilting her head like an alert animal trying to identify an unseen danger. The wind? Some wild animal. No, there was something different about that sound, something deeply unsettling that made her stomach churn in a strange, uncomfortable way. It was a groan. A human groan, faint and muffled by the distance but unmistakably human, and it had a quality of desperation that chilled her blood despite the oppressive heat. She dropped the laundry basket without a second thought, letting it topple over on the ground where it lay abandoned, and started walking toward the sound. Her steps were hesitant at first, fear and curiosity, waging a silent battle inside her. But as she got closer, and the groan became clearer, more distinct, something inside her made the decision. She had to find out what it was. She had to help. She crossed the dry lawn separating the service area from the crops, her flip-flops kicking up little clouds of dust with each step, her heart beginning to pound in her chest. The cornfield opened up before her like a vertical labyrinth, the tall stalks creating green, shaded corridors that partially blocked the merciless sun. The sharp leaves brushed against her bare arms as she pushed forward, leaving small red scratches that stung with sweat, but she barely noticed. She was completely focused on the sound she now heard with disturbing clarity. It wasn't just a groan, it was a plea. Someone was asking for help, for water, for mercy from whoever might be listening. Chloe quickened her pace, pushing the cornstalks aside with trembling hands, panic starting to set in. Who was out here? What had happened? And then, turning past a particularly dense row of stalks, she saw it, and her world stopped. In the middle of the field, tied to an old wooden post driven deep into the dusty ground, was a woman. An elderly woman, her arms grotesquely raised above her head at an angle that looked impossibly uncomfortable, her hands bound by rough, thick ropes that cut into her wrinkled skin, leaving raw, red marks. Her face was swollen and red from brutal exposure to the sun, the skin stretched and shiny in places where blisters were beginning to form. Her lips were completely cracked, bleeding in spots, and her half-closed eyes seemed sunken deep into her skull, surrounded by dark, hollow circles that spoke of extreme exhaustion. She wore a simple dress that had once been white but was now stained with dirt, sweat, and something that could have been dried blood. Her thin, frail body looked like it was about to collapse, as if only sheer willpower was keeping her upright. Her bare feet were swollen and covered in scratches and cuts, and the ground around them was scuffed in a way that suggested she had, at some point, tried to dig or struggle to free herself. Chloe felt her legs grow dangerously weak. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into an eternity, she could do nothing but stare at the horrific, surreal sight, desperately trying to process what her eyes were seeing, but what her mind refused to accept as real. How was this possible? Who, in God's name, would do something like this to another person? To a helpless old woman? And here on this property she thought she knew, where she had worked for 2 years. The woman slowly opened her eyes, as if even that small effort was a monumental challenge beyond her remaining strength, and stared at Chloe with an intensity that cut deep into the young woman's soul. Her eyes, though clouded by dehydration and suffering, still held sparks of life, of consciousness, of a humanity that refused to be completely extinguished. Her cracked lips moved with painful difficulty, and a hoarse, raspy whisper escaped, each word seeming to cost her immense effort. "Water, please. Water." The word broke the shocked trance that had paralyzed Chloe. She ran to the woman in clumsy steps, tripping over exposed roots and clumps of dry earth, nearly falling twice in the short distance that separated them. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely coordinate her movements as she tried to reach the ropes binding the old woman's wrists. But they were too high for her to reach, tied with brutal force in a complicated knot she had no idea how to undo, and her fingers slipped on the coarse material, making no progress. She stood on her tiptoes, tried to jump to get a better grip, but it was useless. Whoever had tied this poor woman here had made sure it was impossible for her to free herself. Tears began to stream down Chloe's face, mixing with her sweat, as frustration and despair overwhelmed her. The old woman moaned softly. With every move Chloe made, each attempt to free her causing more pain to her raw wrists. "I'm going to get help," Chloe finally said, her voice choked and broken by the tears she couldn't control. "I'll be back. I swear on my life. You're going to be okay. I swear I'll bring someone. Please, just hang on a little longer." She didn't know if the old woman had understood her words through the fog of suffering that surely enveloped her consciousness, but she couldn't waste another second. Every minute could be the difference between life and something she didn't even want to consider. She ran out of the cornfield as if the devil himself were on her heels, her heart racing at a frantic pace, her lungs burning with the effort of breathing the hot, dry air, tears blurring her vision so much she almost ran into a tree. She needed to find someone, anyone who could help, and there was only one man on that property she truly trusted, a man who had always treated her with respect and dignity when others saw her as just another unimportant farmhand. Ethan was in his office in the main house, reviewing stacks of export paperwork with the focus of someone who took his business very seriously, when Chloe burst through the door without knocking, without asking permission, without any regard for the protocol that normally governed interactions between employees and employers. He looked up, surprised, ready to gently reprimand the intrusion, But then he truly saw the state she was in. Chloe was a complete wreck, pale as a ghost despite the heat, gasping for breath as if she'd run a marathon, her clothes dirty with soil and leaves, small scratches bleeding on her arms, and her eyes wide with pure, unfiltered panic. There was something in her expression that made all of Ethan's thoughts about exports and profits evaporate instantly. "Mr. Miller," she pleaded, practically screaming the words between sobs, "please, you've got to come with me, right now. There's a woman tied up in the cornfield. She's dying out there under the sun. I swear to God, I'm not making this up. I'm not going crazy. She's there. She needs help. Now. Please, believe me." Ethan frowned deeply, trying to process her words, which seemed to make no sense. A woman? Tied up? In the cornfield on his own farm? How was that possible? "Chloe, are you sure about what you saw?" he began cautiously, rising from his chair. "The heat can play tricks on you. Sometimes we see things that—" "It's not the heat!" she yelled, with an intensity he had never seen in her, interrupting him in a way that would have been unthinkable under any other circumstances. "I saw her with my own eyes. I touched her. I tried to untie her, but the ropes are too high. She asked for water, Mr. Miller. She's conscious, but she can barely speak. If we don't go now, she's going to die, do you understand? She's going to die." There was something in the young woman's absolutely genuine desperation, something in the way her entire body trembled, how her tears fell uncontrollably, that made Ethan make his decision in a split second. He didn't know Chloe to be dramatic or prone to exaggeration. On the contrary, in the 2 years she had worked there, she had always been quiet, reliable, down to earth. If she was in this state, then something truly terrible had happened. "Take me to her now," he said firmly, already grabbing the keys to his pickup truck from a hook by the door. They crossed the property in a tense, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the engine and Chloe's still labored breathing as she pointed the way with nervous gestures. Ethan felt his stomach tighten with each passing moment as they neared the cornfield, a bad feeling growing inside him like a poisonous weed. When they finally reached the edge of the field and got out of the truck, Chloe practically ran ahead, and he followed her through the green corridors she pushed open with determination. And then he saw, and it felt like he had taken a violent punch directly to the chest, knocking all the air from his lungs at once. "My God!" were the only words he could manage, his voice a horrified whisper. The scene was even worse than Chloe had described, worse than any image his mind could have conjured from her words. The old woman hanging from that post looked more dead than alive, a macabre, cruel scarecrow placed there by some sick mind. Ethan strode forward quickly, already pulling the pocket knife he always carried from his pants pocket, his hands shaking visibly as he opened the blade. He cut the ropes with swift but careful movements, trying not to hurt her any more than she already was. As the last rope snapped, the woman collapsed completely into his arms, a surprisingly light weight, as if her body had become nothing but bones and dry skin. He held her as carefully as he could, feeling her frail, broken body tremble slightly against his, and for the first time in many years, Ethan felt tears sting his own eyes. "Chloe, get water. Quick," he ordered, his voice rougher than he intended due to the emotion he was trying to control. The young woman ran back to the pickup truck as if she had wings on her feet, returning in seconds with a bottle of water from the glove compartment. Ethan supported the old woman's head with one hand, tilting it gently, and with the other, he brought the bottle to her cracked and bleeding lips. He wet them slowly, letting her drink in tiny sips, afraid that if she drank too quickly she might choke or throw up. She swallowed with visible difficulty, coughing weakly, but gradually her breathing began to even out, becoming a little less desperate. Her eyes opened a bit more, focusing on Ethan, with an expression he couldn't decipher, but that disturbed him deeply. "We're taking her to the house," Ethan said firmly, lifting the woman into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Chloe, go on ahead and get the upstairs guest room ready. Fresh towels, cold water, open the windows, and don't tell anyone what happened here yet. No one. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Chloe replied, already running ahead of them toward the house. Ethan carried the old woman with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who only knew him as a tough businessman. Each step was measured, careful, as if he were carrying something infinitely precious and fragile that could shatter at the slightest wrong move. And as he looked at that face, scarred by suffering, something strange happened inside him. A disturbing sense of familiarity, as if somewhere in the distant recesses of his memory he knew those features. But that was impossible. He had never seen this woman before in his life. He was sure of it, or was he? The first rays of sun filtered through the gaps in the guest room curtains when the old woman finally opened, her eyes completely. Ethan, who had spent the entire night in an armchair by the bed, woke with the subtle movement of the mattress and immediately stood up, approaching cautiously. During the night, the family doctor had come, examined the woman, administered an IV and left medication. He had diagnosed severe dehydration, second-degree burns on various parts of her body, and extreme exhaustion. If she had been left under that merciless sun for a few more hours, she wouldn't have survived, were the doctor's grave words before he left. The old woman's face still bore the marks of her ordeal, but there was more color in her skin, more clarity in her eyes. She blinked a few times as if trying to get her bearings, to process where she was and how she had gotten there. When her eyes met Ethan's, something in her expression shifted. A complex emotion crossed her face, marked by time and pain. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently, his voice low so as not to startle her. "Do you need anything?" She stared at him for a long moment, her lips moving as if testing whether she could still form words. When she finally spoke, her voice was weak but clear. "Water, please." Ethan carefully poured her a glass, helping her sit up slightly, propping her back with pillows. She drank slowly, in small, deliberate sips, closing her eyes between each one, as if savoring the liquid in a way only someone who has been on the verge of fatal dehydration can understand. Then, she leaned back against the pillows, breathing more easily than the night before. "Thank you," she whispered. And there was so much emotion in that simple phrase that Ethan felt a pang in his chest. "You're welcome. Do you know where you are? Do you know who I am?" She watched him again, and this time there was something different in her penetrating gaze. A mixture of deep sadness, old love, and a pain that seemed to carry the weight of decades. When she spoke, each word dropped into the room like a stone into a still pond, creating ripples that spread in every direction. "I do. You're Ethan Miller, my son." The silence that followed was so thick it felt physical, occupying all available space, making the air hard to breathe. Ethan felt his legs suddenly give way, and had to grab the nightstand to keep from falling. His hands gripped the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. For a long, terrible moment, he thought he had misheard, that the woman was delirious, that the dehydration was still affecting her mind. But the way she looked at him, that intensity of contained emotion, made something inside him twist in a way he couldn't explain. "No," he finally said, shaking his head in vehement denial. "That's not possible. My mother died when I was 8. I remember the funeral, I remember the people in black, I remember crying. For days. You can't be her." "Do you really remember, Ethan?" she asked softly, tears beginning to well in her tired eyes. "Or do you remember what they told you, what they made you believe? Think hard, my son. Try to truly remember. My voice singing you to sleep. The stories I used to tell you before bed. The way I'd run my hand through your hair when you were scared." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, to deny it all. But then something happened. A memory, vague and faded, like an old photograph, surfaced from the depths of his mind. A woman's voice softly singing a lullaby he hadn't heard in decades, gentle hands stroking his hair while thunder boomed outside, the scent of lavender and homemade soap, fragmented images from a time he thought he had completely forgotten, or perhaps had never really existed. "I don't understand," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I was so sure. Everyone told me you had died. My father, my stepmother, everyone. Why would they lie about that?" "Because it was easier," Eleanor explained, her voice gaining strength despite her physical weakness. "Easier to say I died than to explain. That they erased me from your life. That they pushed me away little by little. forbade me from seeing you, from touching you, from being your mother. Your father fell in love with another woman, Ethan, with Beatrice. She was young, beautiful, from the city, full of ambition and plans. And I was just the simple country wife, with no formal education, no refinement, an obstacle in her path to becoming the lady of this farm. But my father wouldn't do that, Ethan protested weakly, even as he felt all his certainties begin to crack like glass under pressure. He was an honorable man, respected by everyone. How could he just erase his own son's mother? Men do terrible things when they're blinded by desire, Eleanor said with evident bitterness. Beatrice knew exactly how to manipulate him. She planted doubts about my ability to be a good mother, about my sanity, about my fitness to raise the Miller heir. She said you needed a more educated, more modern mother figure, and your father, weak as he was when it came to her, agreed to everything. Tears were now flowing freely down Ethan's face. Part of him still resisted, still wanted to believe this was all a mistake, a cruel fabrication. But there was something in the way she spoke, in the details she knew, in the genuine emotion that shone through every word, that made it impossible to simply dismiss her story as delirium. "Tell me," he pleaded, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. "Tell me everything from the beginning. I need to know the truth, even if it hurts." Eleanor took a deep breath, closing her eyes as if gathering the strength to relive memories she had tried to bury for so long. When she began to speak, her voice had a distant quality, as if she were narrating someone else's life, not her own. "I married your father when I was 19. He was older, serious, hard-working. It wasn't a marriage of passion, but of mutual respect. You were born a year later, and it was the happiest day of my life. I held you in my arms and promised I would always protect you, always be by your side. But promises sometimes are broken by forces greater than our will." She paused, taking another sip of water before continuing. "When you were 5, Beatrice showed up. She was the niece of an equipment supplier, came to spend some time on the farm, and your father was completely enchanted. I saw it happening, but I couldn't do anything. I saw the looks between them, the hidden meetings they thought were discreet. And then she began her campaign against me." "How?" Ethan asked, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "In subtle ways at first. Comments about how old-fashioned I was, how I didn't know how to behave in society, how I lacked the education to guide you properly. She convinced your father that you needed a governess, someone more qualified than me. Little by little, I was pushed out of decisions about your upbringing. I could no longer choose your clothes, your food, your schedule. Beatrice did all of that, while I was reduced to an increasingly invisible presence in the house." "And what did my father say about it?" Ethan could only whisper. "At first, he pretended not to notice what was happening. Later, when confronted, he'd say it was for your own good, that I should understand you needed more than I could offer. And then, when you were 7, she gave him the final ultimatum. Me or her, one of us had to leave the main house." Ethan felt nausea rise in his throat. "And he chose her." "He chose. They sent me to a small cottage at the back of the property. They said it was temporary, just until you adjusted to the new situation. But temporary became permanent. I saw you from a distance sometimes, playing in the yard, growing up without me. I tried to approach you once, but the security guard stopped me. Beatrice had given strict orders that I was never to see you again. And then they told you I had died. They even held a fake funeral, a ceremony to give the lie authenticity." Eleanor's voice broke completely now, sobs shaking her frail body. Ethan moved closer, and without thinking, took her hand. It was small and cold, marked by prominent veins and age spots, yet familiar in a way he couldn't rationally explain. "Forgive me," she cried. "Forgive me for not fighting harder, for not finding a way to get to you. I was weak, scared, with no resources. I thought if I just obeyed, if I stayed quiet in my corner, maybe one day you would look for me, discover the truth on your own. But you grew up believing I was dead, and I stayed here, alive but invisible, a ghost on the property that was once my home." "It wasn't your fault," Ethan said, surprising himself with his own words. You were as much a victim as I was, but Beatrice has been dead for years. Why did you stay hidden? Why didn't you come to me when she was gone?" Eleanor wiped her tears with the back of a trembling hand. "I tried. God knows I tried. But then Valerie arrived, and she was worse than Beatrice, much worse. Beatrice at least had some elegance in her cruelty. Valerie was brutal. When she found out about me, when your father confessed on his deathbed, she sought me out. She told me plainly that I was a problem she wouldn't tolerate, that if I tried to approach you, she would throw me off the property without a penny. This land, Ethan, is all I know. Away from here, I would just be another old woman with no family, no money, no future." "So you stayed," Ethan said, finally understanding the scope of the tragedy. "You stayed in the shadows, invisible, while life happened around you." "I stayed. And as the years went by, I became more and more of an inconvenience to Valerie. She wanted to erase me completely, not just from your life, but from existence itself, and she finally decided to do just that." "She was the one who had you tied to that post," Ethan said, not as a question, but as a statement, finally grasping the truth. "She was. She said it was time for me to disappear for good, that no one would ask about me, because no one remembered I existed. And she was almost right. If it weren't for that young woman, Chloe, I wouldn't be here now." As if summoned by the mention of her name, a soft knock came at the door. Chloe entered carrying a tray with soup, fresh bread and tea. She stopped when she saw Ethan holding Eleanor's hand, both their faces streaked with tears, and a gentle, sad smile appeared on her young face. "Sorry to interrupt," she said quietly. "I brought something for you to eat. The doctor said you need to eat slowly, light things." "Thank you, my dear," Eleanor said, looking at Chloe with such affection that the young woman felt her own eyes sting. "You saved my life. I will never forget it." "I just did what anyone should do," Chloe replied, placing the tray on the small table. "No one deserves to go through what you went through." Eleanor watched Chloe intently as the young woman arranged the tray, adjusted the pillows, showing the natural care that some people just have. There was something about her that caught the old woman's attention, something beyond her obvious kindness. A familiarity she couldn't name, but that touched a deep part of her soul. "What's your full name, dear?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "Chloe Ann Davis, Mum." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Eleanor closed her eyes tightly, an expression of pain crossing her face. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Davis," Eleanor whispered, opening her eyes and staring at Chloe with a new, startling intensity. "Your middle name is Davis, like mine, like my maiden name." "It's my mother's last name," Chloe explained, confused by the reaction. "Her name was Helen Davis. She passed away when I was very little. I was raised by my grandmother, but she was gone too by the time I was 5. I never knew much about my mom's family. She never talked about it." Eleanor began to cry again, but this time they were different tears. Tears of recognition, of discovery, of a truth that was both devastating and miraculous. "Helen," she repeated, the name leaving her lips like a prayer. "My Helen, my daughter they took from me, my little girl I never got to raise." Chloe suddenly went pale, her legs buckling. "What are you saying?" "I had another child," Eleanor confessed, looking back and forth between Ethan and Chloe. "A daughter, Helen. She was born at a difficult time, the result of a mistake I made when I was lonely and desperate. Beatrice found out and gave me another impossible choice. Either Helen went away to be raised by another family, or I would lose Ethan too. How can a mother choose between her children? They took my baby girl. They said she would have a better life away from me, and I never saw her again. I spent decades not knowing what had happened to her." The tray fell from Chloe's hands, shattering on the floor in 1,000 pieces, but no one seemed to notice. The young woman was paralyzed, her face showing a rapid succession of emotions she couldn't process. "So she began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "Your grandmother," Eleanor completed, holding out a trembling hand. "You are my granddaughter, Chloe, my blood, my family that I thought I had lost forever." And in that moment, in that room heavy with impossible revelations, 3 generations of a shattered family finally found each other. Ethan looked at Chloe with new eyes, realizing that this young woman who had always been just an employee was in fact his niece, his family. Chloe looked at Eleanor with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension, all the loose pieces of her life finally clicking into a pattern that made painful sense. And Eleanor looked at them both with a love so intense it seemed physical, palpable in the air between them. Outside, the sun continued its relentless journey across the sky. But inside that room, something fundamental had changed. The truth, buried for so long, had finally come to light, and nothing would ever be the same. The following days brought a subtle but noticeable transformation to Sweetwater Farms. Eleanor recovered slowly, gaining strength, while Ethan spent hours by her side, listening to stories that filled the void in his memory, rebuilding the childhood that had been stolen from him. Chloe, discovering she was part of a family, floated between shock and a hesitant joy. But not all was peaceful. Valerie had become a tense presence, her irritation palpable in the hallways, in her icy glares, in the harsh way she treated the staff. One morning, Chloe woke early with a specific task. Valerie had summoned her the night before, brusquely, ordering her to organize the storage room in the old wing of the house. It was a job no one had done in years, and the young woman knew perfectly well it was just a way to keep her busy and away from Eleanor. But she didn't complain. In fact, she was almost grateful to have something concrete to do while she processed all the revelations that were changing her life in ways she still couldn't fully comprehend. The storage room was on the second floor of the oldest part of the building, a forgotten area of the house that rarely saw visitors. When Chloe pushed open the heavy door, she was met with an intense smell of must, dust, and stagnant time. The floorboards creaked loudly under her bare feet as she walked to the windows, opening them one by one to let in light and fresh air. Tiny dust particles danced in the sunbeams that flooded the space, creating an almost magical effect that contrasted with the mundane nature of the task ahead. There was furniture covered in dusty sheets, boxes piled in dark corners, old trunks with rusted locks. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a place where objects and memories had been deliberately forgotten, left behind because remembering was too painful. Chloe started with the smaller cabinets, opening doors that groaned on unoiled hinges, separating what was still useful from what should be thrown out. It was when she opened the third cabinet further back and hidden behind a pile of broken chairs that something unexpected caught her eye. Tucked between time-yellowed tablecloths and outdated curtains was a rectangular volume carefully wrapped in a cotton cloth that had once been white but was now a faded, indeterminate yellow. Chloe pulled it out carefully, holding the object with an instinctive reverence, and discovered it was an old journal bound in worn, time-marked leather. Her heart began to beat faster without her understanding why. There was something about this object that felt important, that seemed to be waiting to be found. She sat on the dusty floor, not caring about the dirt that would stain her clothes, and carefully opened the first page. The handwriting was delicate and feminine, written in a blue fountain pen ink that had faded but was still perfectly legible. At the top of the page, a date that made Chloe hold her breath, March 1983, and just below it, a sentence that made her heart race. This is the diary of Eleanor Davis Miller. If anyone should ever find this, let them know that these words are my only truth in a world of lies. Chloe glanced nervously at the door, making sure she was alone, that no one could see her reading this. She knew she was about to invade someone's deepest privacy, to read thoughts never meant for strange eyes. But something stronger compelled her to continue, an urgent need to understand, to know the full story to piece together the impossible puzzle her life had become. She turned the page with trembling fingers and began to read. The first entries were of ordinary days, the simple routine of the farm, small moments of happiness with Ethan when he was still a child. Eleanor wrote with palpable love about her son, about his first years, the joy of seeing him take his first steps, say his first words, grow up strong and healthy. There was tenderness in every sentence, a maternal love so pure and intense that Chloe felt tears sting her eyes even reading about people and moments she hadn't witnessed, But as the pages turned, as months became years in the dated entries, the tone changed dramatically. References to a woman named Beatrice began to appear, who had come from the city and won Arthur's heart in a way Eleanor couldn't compete with. The entries became shorter, more bitter, laden with a growing pain. "She looks at me with such disdain," Eleanor had written in a July 1984 entry. "As if I'm just an obstacle in her path to everything she wants. Arthur doesn't see it, or maybe he doesn't want to. He's completely blinded by what he feels for her. And I, with each passing day, feel myself disappearing a little more. Sometimes I look in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back. I'm becoming invisible in my own home." Chloe turned more pages, increasingly engrossed in the painful narrative. The entries became more sporadic, more desperate. Eleanor described in detail how she was systematically pushed out of the main house, how decisions about Ethan were made without consulting her, how Beatrice gradually took over all the roles that were once hers, while she was relegated to a state of progressive, cruel invisibility. And then came the revelation that made Chloe stop breathing for a moment. An entry from January 1985, written in a hastier, more desperate hand than the others. "I found out today that I'm expecting another child, but it's not Arthur's. He's barely touched me in months, barely looks at me when I pass him in the halls. This baby is the result of a terrible mistake, of a night when I sought comfort in the arms of someone who should have only been a friend. I'm terrified of what will happen when they find out. If Beatrice knows, she'll throw me off this farm for good. And if Arthur finds out, I'll never be able to see Ethan again. What do I do? How can I carry this secret alone? Where do I turn when I have no one?" Chloe stopped reading, her chest tight, tears blurring her vision. Eleanor had another child, a daughter she knew now. Helen, her mother. A few pages later, there was an entry about the birth, written in a shaky hand that betrayed the violent emotion of the writer. "She was born today, in the early morning, far from the big house, far from all the curious and judging eyes. I named her Helen, after my own mother who passed when I was too young to clearly remember her. My little girl is perfect. She has deep, dark eyes like the night sky and rosy cheeks that beg to be kissed. But I know I can't keep her. Beatrice has already found out everything. I don't know how, but she always finds out everything. And she gave me a cruel ultimatum. Either Helen goes away to be raised by another family far from here, or I go away and never see Ethan again. How can a mother make such a choice? How can I choose between one child and another? But I chose, God forgive me. I let Helen go because I couldn't completely abandon Ethan. And now I have to live knowing I abandoned my daughter to maintain some proximity to my son. What kind of mother am I?" The following pages were pure pain, fragmented accounts of a woman tearing herself apart from the inside. Eleanor wrote about letters she managed to receive over the years, brought secretly by people who pitied her. Letters about Helen growing up strong and healthy, about the girl becoming a woman, about her eventually having a daughter of her own. A granddaughter Eleanor would never know, or so she had thought until that very moment. Chloe slammed the diary shut, her whole body trembling. It all made sense now. Everything. Helen was her mother, the woman who never spoke of her family, who always changed the subject when asked about her origins. Because she herself didn't know. She had been raised far away from it all, without knowing the truth of her birth, of the mother who was forced to give her up. And her grandmother, the mysterious woman who had raised her for only 5 years before she passed, was likely the person who had received Helen from those who took her from Eleanor. She continued reading with growing veracity, tears now falling freely, staining some of the already fragile pages. Eleanor wrote about the years of progressive isolation, about being increasingly erased, not just from Ethan's life, but from her very existence on the farm. There were entries about seeing him from afar, growing up without remembering her, about the searing pain of being a stranger to her own son. When Beatrice passed away, Eleanor had written with cautious hope, "I thought I could finally approach Ethan again, that I could reveal the truth, reclaim something of what we lost." But then Valerie arrived, and she is worse than Beatrice, much worse. Beatrice at least had some elegance in her cruelty, some veneer of civility. Valerie is brutal and direct. She doesn't hide her contempt. She says plainly that I am a ghost who should remain buried. She threatens to kick me out, to send me away with nothing. But where would I go? This land, as bad as it has become for me, is all I know. It's where my children were born, where some part of me still waits for recognition, for justice, for love. The last entry was recent, from only a few weeks ago. The handwriting was shakier, revealing the advanced age of the writer, but the emotion was just as intense. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Valerie wants me out of the way for good, not just invisible, but completely non-existent. I'm afraid of what she's capable of to achieve that goal. If something happens to me, if I truly disappear this time, let this diary be the proof that I existed, that I loved, that I was a mother, and let Helen know wherever she is that I never stopped thinking of her, not for a single day of all these terrible, lonely years. Chloe closed the journal reverently, holding it to her chest as if it were the most precious object in the world, which perhaps it was. It was concrete proof of everything Eleanor had said, of everything they had discovered. It wasn't just spoken words that could be questioned or disbelieved. It was written, dated, detailed evidence. It was documented truth. She stood up quickly, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand, and tucked the diary inside her shirt, against her skin. She had to show this to Ethan and Eleanor. She needed them to know that the truth wasn't just in memories and words, but recorded forever on those yellowed pages. She went down the stairs as fast as she could without running, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would leap from her chest. When she reached the guest room, Eleanor was sitting in an armchair by the window looking out at the garden she could finally see without fear. Ethan was beside her, talking quietly about something Chloe couldn't hear. They both turned as she entered so abruptly. Chloe locked the door behind her with trembling hands and pulled out the diary, holding it out to Eleanor as if offering a stolen treasure finally being returned to its rightful owner. "I found this in the storage room," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Hidden in the back of a cabinet, and I need you to confirm it for me. Helen Davis, the daughter you mentioned, she was my mother, wasn't she?" Eleanor's eyes widened at the sight of the diary, her hands flying to her chest in an involuntary gesture, as if trying to hold in her heart. Her face went pale, then red, then pale again, as a rapid succession of emotions crossed her features. She looked up at Chloe, and in her eyes was recognition, pain, hope, and a love so intense it seemed impossible to contain in such a frail body. "She was," she whispered, her voice breaking completely. "She was my daughter, my Helen, my little girl I never got to raise, never got to hold long enough, never got to love the way a mother should. And I," Chloe continued, tears falling uncontrollably again, "I'm her daughter, which means you're my grandmother, that we're real family, that I'm not alone in the world like I always thought I was." "My granddaughter," Eleanor completed, extending her trembling arms in a silent plea. "You are my granddaughter, Chloe, my blood, my family that I thought I had lost forever." Chloe crossed the room in 3 long strides and fell into Eleanor's arms, sobbing loudly now, the full weight of years of loneliness and unanswered questions. Finally finding release, the old woman hugged her with all the strength her recovering body allowed, crying too, murmuring unintelligible words of love and relief and gratitude for this second chance life was giving her. Ethan watched the scene in silent shock, the diary now in his hands, flipping through the pages with eyes that saw but couldn't yet fully process. Chloe wasn't just a kind employee who had saved his mother. She was his niece. She was family. And all this truth, this painful, complex story had been here all along, hidden in a dusty storage room waiting to be found. That's when they heard heavy, rapid footsteps in the hall. The doorknob turned with violent force, but the door was locked. Impatient knocks echoed through the wood, followed by a voice they all recognized immediately. "Ethan, open this door now!" Valerie's voice was shrill, furious, filled with a rage she no longer tried to hide. "What is going on in there?" Ethan stood up slowly, carefully setting the diary aside, exchanging a meaningful look with Eleanor and Chloe. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation he knew was inevitable, but no longer feared. He had the truth on his side. He had proof. He had family. And that was stronger than any lie Valerie could try to maintain. He opened the door with a firm movement and found Valerie standing there, her face red with anger, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury, her body as tense as a rope about to snap. She pushed past him unceremoniously, stopping short when she saw Chloe still in Eleanor's arms, both their faces marked by tears, but also by something that looked a lot like determination. "What is this?" Valerie demanded, her voice rising. "What is this circus you've got going on in this room?" "It's not a circus, Valerie," Ethan said, stepping forward and blocking her view of the two women. "It's family. It's truth. It's everything you tried to destroy but couldn't. And now you're going to listen to every word I have to say, every revelation, every accusation. And you're not going to run from them this time." The silence that followed Ethan's declaration was as thick and suffocating as the air before a storm. Valerie looked back and forth between him, Eleanor, and Chloe, her face cycling through a rapid succession of expressions. That revealed far more than she would have liked. Surprise, anger, fear, and finally that mask of control she wore so well, trying to compose herself even as the world she had built began to crumble around her. "Truths?" she repeated, forcing a laugh that came out shrill and fake. "What kind of cheap theatre is this, Ethan? Are you really going to believe this woman's fantasy stories? And now this housekeeper is in on the act too? I didn't think you were so easily manipulated." Ethan felt anger rise like hot lava inside him, but he kept his voice, firm and controlled. "This housekeeper has a name, Chloe, and she's not just an employee in this house, she's my niece, the daughter of the sister I never knew I had, the granddaughter of the mother you made me forget. And no, Valerie, I'm not being manipulated. I'm finally seeing the truth after years of living in your lie." Valerie paled visibly, the mask faltering for a brief moment before she regained her composure. "This is utterly ridiculous. You're being conned. This woman shows up out of nowhere after decades. This girl conveniently finds an old diary, and suddenly you're all one big happy family. Please, Ethan, you've always been smarter than this. Don't let yourself be swayed by cheap sentimentality." "I read the diary, Valerie," Ethan retorted, taking the leather-bound journal from Chloe's hands and holding it up before her like irrefutable evidence. "Every word, every date, every name, including yours. Yes, you're mentioned in here more than once. Eleanor knew you very well. She knew exactly what you were capable of, and she was right to be afraid of you." Valerie lunged forward, trying to snatch the diary from his hands in a sudden, desperate move, but Ethan stepped back nimbly, keeping the journal out of her reach. Her eyes now blazed with a fury she could no longer disguise, all pretense of composure finally abandoned. "Give me that now," she hissed through clenched teeth. "This is none of your business. It's just the ramblings of a confused old woman." "How is it not my business?" Ethan shouted, and it was the first time in years Chloe had seen him completely lose his cool. "It's about my mother, about my family, about the entire life you stole from me, about all the lies you fed me since I was a child. How dare you say it's not my business?" Eleanor, still seated but with a straight, dignified posture, despite her physical frailty, watched Valerie with an expression that mixed pain, pity, and something close to bitter understanding. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low but clear. "You knew who I was when Arthur confessed about me on his deathbed. You knew the whole story, what Beatrice had done to me, how I had been erased. And you decided to pick up where she left off. You decided it was more convenient to keep the ghost buried than to let the truth come out." Valerie turned to her eyes flashing. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was low but laced with venom. "You never should have been. It was a simple arrangement. You stayed quiet in the cottage out back, invisible, and we took care of your basic needs. But you couldn't stay in your place, could you? You had to show up, had to be seen, had to exist when your only job was to not exist. You had to ruin everything." "So it was you," Chloe said suddenly, her voice trembling, but filled with contained anger. "You were the one who tied her up in the cornfield, who left her to die under the sun like an animal. How could you do that to another person, to a helpless old woman?" "I did no such thing," Valerie answered too quickly, too defensively. her words stumbling over each other. She must have wandered off, gotten lost. Old people get confused, everyone knows that. It's not my fault she can't take care of herself anymore. Lies, Eleanor said, and there was a strength in her voice that surprised everyone in the room. You came to my cottage yourself that morning. You told me it was time for me to leave for good, that my presence was a problem you would no longer tolerate. When I tried to resist, when I said I had as much right to be here as you did, you called 2 of your trusted men. They took me to the cornfield. You personally ordered them to tie me to that post. I heard you say the sun would take care of the rest, that no one would ask about me because no one knew I existed. No one cared. And you were almost right, weren't you? The words fell into the room like bombs, each one exploding and leaving wreckage behind. Ethan felt his legs go weak. He had to lean on the nightstand again. Chloe covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with horror. The entire room seemed to spin around them as they processed the enormity of that confession. Valerie stood there for a long moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly, searching for an escape that no longer existed. When she spoke, her voice had lost all pretense of innocence. You can't prove any of that. It's her word against mine. Who are you going to believe, Ethan? A woman who vanished from your life 40 years ago, or the woman who's been by your side for the last 5? The one who took care of you, this farm, everything. I believe her, Ethan said without hesitation, his voice as firm as a rock. Because every word that comes out of her mouth brings back memories I didn't even know I had. Because when she tells stories about my childhood, I can feel it in my soul. I can see images that were buried, so deep I thought they were just dreams. And because deep down in my heart I always knew something was profoundly wrong, I always felt this emptiness, this sense that something fundamental had been taken from me. You made me believe it was paranoia, that I was inventing problems, but I wasn't. I was feeling her absence, the absence of the truth. Valerie took a step back as if she had been physically struck, her face showing for the first time something that looked like true vulnerability. But it was only for an instant, before the anger returned with full force. You're going to let me leave now, she ordered, trying to reclaim a tone of authority she no longer possessed. And we're all going to forget this ridiculous conversation. Tomorrow, this woman will be out of here, and everything will go back to normal, to how it always should have been. No, Ethan replied with absolute calm. You're going to stay here until I decide exactly what to do with you. I'm going to gather witnesses. I'm going to document everything. I'm going to make sure you answer for what you've done. And Eleanor isn't going anywhere. This was always her home. You're the intruder here. You're the one who doesn't belong. Chloe watched it all with a racing heart. Part of her wanted to intervene, but she knew this was a moment Ethan needed to face alone. It was the necessary break, the cutting of the invisible cord that had tied him for so long to Valerie's manipulations. The woman switched tactics with impressive speed. Her eyes filled with tears that looked genuine. Her voice became soft and pleading. Ethan, my love, please. You're confused, you're stressed, I understand completely, but don't do this. Don't throw away everything we've built together all these years. Because of stories from the past, I love you, you know I love you. Don't let them destroy what we have. But Ethan was unmoved. If you truly loved me, Valerie, you never would have done what you did. You never would have hidden the truth from me for all these years. You never would have tried to kill my mother. Love isn't built on lies and cruelty. Whatever we had, if we ever had anything real, it ended the moment you tied a helpless woman to a post to die. The words hung in the air, as final and irreversible as a sentence. Valerie realized in that moment that she had lost completely. All the manipulation, all the control she had wielded so effectively for years, was all crumbling like a house of cards in a strong breeze. You'll regret this, she said, her voice now hard again, devoid of any pretense of tenderness. I'll leave this farm and take with me everything that is rightfully mine. The documents your dear mother so generously signed over to me when she thought she could buy me off. The assets, the rights, you'll find. There's not much left without me, Ethan. Ethan smiled, but it was a sad smile without a trace of humor. You can take it all. I don't care about material things. I'd rather start from scratch with the truth than continue to be rich on a foundation of lies. And as for the documents, my lawyers are already reviewing every transfer you made. Anything obtained through coercion or fraud will be reversed. You know that. Valerie stared at him for a few more seconds, and in that moment, Chloe saw clearly what she really was beneath the carefully constructed facade. There was anger, yes, but also fear. Fear of losing everything, fear of facing consequences, fear of having to rebuild a life away from the position of power she so cherished. "This isn't over," she spat the words like venom. "You'll come looking for me. You'll realize your mistake when you're all alone with these two feeding on your emotions, and by then, it will be too late." She turned and left, slamming the door so hard the pictures on the walls rattled. Her footsteps echoed down the hall, fast and furious, accompanied by the sounds of doors being thrown, open and slammed shut, drawers being emptied, her rage manifesting in the brutal way she treated the objects around her. Ethan sat down heavily in the armchair, running his hands over his face in a gesture of deep exhaustion. Eleanor and Chloe exchanged a look before Chloe went to him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder in a silent attempt at comfort. "You did the right thing," she said softly, her voice full of sincerity. "I know it hurts, but it was necessary." "I know," he replied, his voice tired but also tinged with relief. "It hurts because I realize my entire life has been based on lies. That the person I trusted, the person I shared my life with, was capable of something so monstrous. But at the same time, I feel like I can finally breathe, like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying has been lifted from my shoulders." "Pain is part of healing," Eleanor said from the chair where she remained seated, her voice soft but full of wisdom born from suffering. "It hurts because you're finally feeling everything that was suppressed for decades. But it will pass, my son. On the other side of this pain is the truth, and the truth always sets you free, even when it burns on its way out." In the hours that followed, the farm was seized by an unusual commotion. Valerie packed her things in a frantic hurry, shouting orders at confused employees who barely knew how to respond. Some tried to help her out of habit or fear. Others simply watched from a distance, processing the dramatic change happening before their eyes. Chloe went down to the kitchen when things had calmed down a bit and found Celia making tea, her hands trembling slightly, her face marked by recent tears. The cook looked up when the young woman entered, and there was so much guilt in her eyes that Chloe felt her heart ache. "Is it true, then?" Celia asked in a low, broken voice. "Did she really do that to Miss Eleanor? Tie her up to die?" Chloe nodded, sitting down at the heavy wooden table that dominated the center of the kitchen. "She did, and she tried to cover it all up, to make it seem like nothing happened. But the truth is, out now, and there's no going back." Celia closed, her eyes tightly, tears now streaming freely. "I knew," she confessed in an anguished whisper. "God forgive me, but I knew something was very wrong. I'd see Miss Eleanor from a distance sometimes, when I went to the back of the property, looking too thin, too sad, and I pretended not to see because I was scared of losing my job, scared I couldn't support my grandkids. But that doesn't excuse it. It never will. I should have done something, anything." "You can do something now," Chloe said firmly, taking the cook's wrinkled hand. "You can tell the truth. You can confirm what you saw, what you knew. Your word matters, Celia. Everyone's words matter now." Celia nodded, determination dawning in her red-rimmed eyes. "I will. To whoever needs to hear it. To the authorities if I have to. I'm not going to be afraid anymore. I won't be a silent accomplice to injustice any longer." Other people began to trickle into the kitchen as the news spread. Gerald, the oldest caretaker, stood with his hat in his hands and shame on his face, recounting how he had seen Eleanor being taken to the back of the property decades ago when he was just a boy working with his father. Dolores, who did the laundry, admitted between sobs that she had been forbidden from washing the old woman's clothes, from having any contact with her. One by one, the employees who had kept silent out of fear, out of necessity, out of direct orders, began to speak, to bear witness, to confirm that Eleanor was not a stranger, but someone who had always been there, just invisible to those who chose not to see. By the time night fell completely on the farm, Valerie was gone. She had taken her hastily packed bags, a few personal belongings, and the bitter promise that this wasn't over. But Ethan didn't care. For the first time in many years, he felt he could breathe freely. that he could be honest with himself about who he was and where he came from. He went up to the room where Eleanor and Chloe were now talking quietly, sharing stories, filling the empty spaces of lost decades with words and tears and hesitant laughter. He stopped at the door, watching them, and felt something warm deep in his chest. This was family, this was real, and it was worth infinitely more than any comfortable lie he had ever believed to be true. "May I come in?" he asked softly. They both smiled and waved him over, making room on the bed where they were sitting. Ethan settled in between them, and for the first time in a long time, he felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The road ahead would be difficult, he knew. There would be consequences, challenges, maybe even legal battles. But it didn't matter. Because now he had something he had never truly had before. He had his family back, and he was ready to fight for them. The first rays of sun were filtering through the curtains when Ethan woke up. For the first time in years he had slept deeply, without nightmares, without that nagging feeling that something was wrong. He got up and went to the window to watch the farm awaken under the golden light. The hands were already starting their chores, the cattle lowing in the distance, the sky tinged with pink, promising another hot day. There was something different in the air, a lightness, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the entire property. He went down to the kitchen and found Chloe making coffee. She smiled radiantly. "Good morning, Uncle Ethan," she said. He was an uncle. He had family. "Good morning, niece," he replied, laughing. "How's my grandmother?" "Better every day. We talked for hours yesterday. She told me about my mother, about the family. It all finally makes sense." Ethan nodded. He had also spent the night listening to Eleanor, her stories filling gaps in his memory. The more he listened, the more he remembered, as if his mind could finally access what had been locked away for decades. After breakfast, he decided to speak to all the employees. He asked Chloe to gather them in the main yard. When everyone was present, he stood on the porch to be seen. He thanked them for coming and began to explain the truth about Eleanor, his mother who had been kept hidden for so many years. "I want to thank all of you for being here," Ethan began, his voice firm but filled with genuine emotion. "I know the last few days have been extremely confusing, full of changes and revelations no one expected. You all deserve to know the full truth about what happened. The woman Chloe found tied up in the cornfield is not a stranger who trespassed on our property. She is Eleanor Davis Miller, my mother. She has always been here, on this farm, but she was kept hidden, pushed aside, treated as if she didn't exist. This was a terrible injustice that went on for far too long." Murmurs rippled through the assembled workers. Some seemed genuinely surprised. Others had clearly suspected something was deeply wrong for years. Celia and Gerald exchanged looks heavy with shared meaning and guilt. "What happened to her is unacceptable," he continued. "Nothing like it will ever happen here again. No one will be forgotten, silenced, or disrespected. This farm is a place of work and dignity." A few people applauded. Ethan went on to say that anyone who wanted to speak about what they had seen would be protected. Gerald stepped forward and recounted seeing Eleanor being taken to the back of the property years ago when he worked with his father. He had obeyed out of fear, and now he was sorry. Ethan immediately came down the steps and placed a hand on the older man's shoulder in a gesture of understanding and forgiveness. "You don't have to apologize, Gerald. Fear is a very powerful and real prison. The important thing is that we are all free from it now. We can start over with honesty." Other employees then began to speak up, each sharing small fragments of the truth they had held for years. Dolores tearfully told of the time she had snuck food to Eleanor when no one was looking. Celia admitted to pretending not to see her when they occasionally crossed paths on the property. It was as if an emotional dam had finally broken, and everything that had been held back for so long could flow freely for the first time. When the meeting ended nearly an hour later, Ethan felt that something fundamental and profound had changed forever. It wasn't just about Eleanor, or Chloe, or Valerie. It was about this entire community of people, about how they related to one another, about the kind of place Sweetwater Farms would be from now on. A place of truth, not of complicit silence. He went back inside the house and up to Eleanor's room. She was sitting in a comfortable armchair by the open window, looking out at the landscape that had always been hers by right, but from which she had been so cruelly deprived. The garden was blooming below, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, and everything seemed more alive somehow. She turned as he entered, and there was a serene peace on her wrinkled face. "I heard you talking with the staff down there," she said softly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Your father would be so proud of the man you've become, Ethan. Even if it took all this time to get here, you made it. And that's what really matters in the end." Ethan sat on the edge of the bed facing her, taking her small, cool hands in his. "Mom," he said, the words still coming with some difficulty but more naturally each time. "There's so much I want to do to somehow make up for all the time we lost, but I don't even know where to begin." Eleanor squeezed his hands with the surprising strength she was regaining. "You don't have to make up for anything, my dear son. The past is gone and can't be changed, no matter. Oh, how much we wish it could. What truly matters is the present, this moment right now, that we can be here together, rebuilding what was broken so long ago. And we have Chloe with us too, my granddaughter, your niece. A precious second chance that God or fate gave us when we had stopped hoping for miracles." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Chloe appeared at the door at that exact moment, carrying a tray with hot tea and still warm homemade cookies. "May I come in?" she asked with that smile that could light up any room. "Of course, dear," Eleanor replied with maternal tenderness. "Come, sit with us. You're as much a part of this family as either of us." Chloe carefully placed the tray on the side table and settled on the floor, leaning against the wall, in a way that reminded her of being a child listening to stories from the grandmother she had barely known. The three of them sat there talking for hours about the next steps, about the changes needed on the farm, about how to properly honor the memory of those who had been forgotten or erased. "I want to turn the cottage where you lived into a memorial," Ethan said suddenly, the idea blooming in his mind with crystal clarity. "Not a place of morbid sadness, but of meaningful remembrance and learning, so that no one ever forgets what happened there, so that this terrible story is never repeated, not here or anywhere else." Eleanor considered the idea silently for a few moments and then nodded in approval. "That's a good idea, my son. Turning pain into learning has immense value, but not just a static memorial. I want it to be a place of welcome, too, for people who need help, a safe place, someone to see them and acknowledge their humanity. Let that space of exclusion and suffering become a space of inclusion and healing." Chloe felt her eyes well up with grateful tears again. "You're incredible people," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Both of you. To be able to turn so much suffering into something that will help others. That's truly extraordinary." The days that followed were ones of intense activity and profound transformation. Ethan immediately began to reorganize the entire farm administration, working with lawyers to reverse the fraudulent transfers Valerie had made, recovering important documents and assets she had tried to siphon off. He discovered she had been meticulous in her attempts at theft, but her hasty actions when confronted had left clear trails that made recovering everything much easier. A competent lawyer was hired to ensure Eleanor received all the legal recognition she deserved as the legitimate mother and first wife of Arthur Miller. Paperwork was organized, witness statements were taken and documented, and gradually the official truth began to align with the real truth that had always existed but had been denied. The cottage at the back of the property was completely renovated with care and purpose. It was transformed into a small support center for farm workers and their families, offering basic medical assistance, educational support for children, and psychological counseling for anyone who needed it. Eleanor made a point of actively participating in the inauguration a few weeks later, cutting the ceremonial ribbon alongside Ethan and Chloe, the three of them smiling for the photographs that would document that historic moment of redemption and new beginnings. Chloe, who had once been just an invisible housekeeper with no clear future, now had a completely different and meaningful role on the farm and in the family. Ethan insisted that she go to college, that she fulfill the educational dreams she had set aside out of necessity. He enrolled her in an excellent college in Alexandria, ensuring she would have everything she needed to build the bright future she wanted for herself. But the young woman made a point of returning to the farm whenever she could, especially on weekends, to be near Eleanor, to care for the grandmother she had finally met, and to strengthen the family bonds that were being rebuilt one precious piece at a time. Eleanor, for her part, visibly blossomed with each passing day. She gained a healthy weight, her skin regained its vitality and glow, and her smile returned more and more frequently. She spent sunny afternoons in the flower garden she had always loved, but had been deprived of, personally tending to the flowers with hands that were rediscovering the pleasure of free labor. And every night, without exception, before going to sleep, Ethan would go to her room, sit by her bed, and ask her to tell him a story. Just like she used to when he was a little boy, just like she should have been doing all those stolen years. One hot Sunday in October, exactly 3 months after the dramatic rescue, the farm hosted a special and meaningful celebration. It was Eleanor's birthday, and Ethan made sure to gather all the employees, some friends from the area who knew the story, and celebrate not just another year of life, but the complete rebirth of this woman who had refused to be erased. In the middle of the joyful party, with live music and plenty of food, Eleanor asked for everyone's attention. They all stopped immediately to listen with respect. She stood beside Ethan and Chloe, the 3 generations finally reunited and visible. "I want to deeply thank everyone who is here today celebrating with me," she began, her voice firm and clear despite her age. "I spent many years completely invisible, forgotten, truly believing that I didn't matter to anyone in this world. But I discovered that I always mattered. To my son, who unknowingly carried my living memories inside him. To my granddaughter, who sought me out without even knowing who I really was. And to each of you, who even paralyzed by fear held on to precious little pieces of the truth until it could finally be revealed. Today I don't just celebrate the years I've lived, but I celebrate the life that was given back to me, and I promise to honor it intensely every single day I have left." Everyone applauded emotionally, many wept openly, and the party continued late into the night under a magnificent, clear, starry sky. When the farm finally fell silent and everyone had gone to bed, Ethan stood alone on the porch, looking up at the infinite stars. Chloe joined him a short while later, bringing 2 cups of hot tea. "What are you thinking about, Uncle?" she asked softly. "About how life can change so radically, so quickly," he answered thoughtfully. "Just 3 months ago, I was living a lie I thought was comfortable and true. Today, I'm living a truth that is still sometimes uncomfortable, but it's infinitely more real, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world." "Me neither," Chloe agreed fervently. "I spent my whole life feeling incomplete, like something fundamental was missing. Now I know it wasn't something missing, it was people, it was family, it was you." The 2 stood there in comfortable, companionable silence until Eleanor appeared at the door, wrapped in a colorful shawl. "Are you 2 going to stand there contemplating the universe all night, or are you coming to bed?" she asked, with a mischievous smile that made her look decades younger. Ethan laughed genuinely and offered her his arm in a chivalrous gesture. "We're coming to bed, Mom. We have a whole new day ahead of us tomorrow." "That we do," Eleanor agreed with palpable joy. "We have all the days we want now, because we are finally completely free. Free from fear, free from lies, free to be exactly who we were always meant to be." The 3 of them went inside together, closing the door softly behind them. Outside, Sweetwater Farms slept peacefully under the infinite starry sky, its blessed lands now holding not just old stories of pain and cruel silence, but also new stories of redemption, of courageous truth, and of a love that had miraculously survived decades of forced forgetting. In the end, it wasn't power that saved Eleanor from certain death. It wasn't money or social standing. It was the genuine courage of a young woman who refused to look the other way when faced with injustice. It was the painful honesty of a son who consciously chose uncomfortable truth over a comfortable lie. It was the unwavering strength of a woman who, despite being systematically erased, never truly ceased to exist. And there, on that farm in rural Louisiana, 3 generations of a brutally broken family finally found their way back to each other. Not to erase the terrible past, That would be impossible and dishonest. But to honor it with truth, to learn deeply from it, and to build a future where no one would ever be forgotten again, where all voices would be heard clearly, and where the truth, however painful at first, would always have a sacred space to flourish. End of story. Dear listeners, we truly hope the story of Eleanor, Ethan, and Chloe has touched your hearts. If you were moved by this intense journey of reunion, truth, and redemption, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what part of this story resonated with you the most. Every day we bring you intense and moving stories like this one, revealing the deepest and truest side of the human soul, and reminding us that it's never too late to do the right thing. We can't wait to see you in the next episode.